Welcome into the Ducks post-game scoreboard show brought to you by Pacific Office Automation. I'm Ryan Buckley. Across from me, Will Ortner. Behind the glass, Jordan Schultz. And gentlemen, for the first time this season, a victorious edition of the Ducks post-game scoreboard show, albeit a little clunky. Wasn't maybe what everyone expected to see tonight, but it is a win. Your Oregon Ducks, number 3 in the country, they beat the Idaho Vandals 24-14. But we do need to get into some first reactions, and I know, Will, when we have had these conversations in the past, whether it is a doormat of a conference opponent, whether it is an early season non-conference opponent from either a smaller division or a smaller conference, you often say it's supposed to look a certain way. Right. That seemed like one of those types of games tonight where it should look a certain way. Did it?
No, absolutely not. Unless you're an Idaho fan, then it certainly looked like the standard you want to play at. No, for Oregon, frankly, I was disappointed in the offensive line play. I felt like you went in there with a lot of hype, and last year you had a bunch of guys who were transfers in. Right now you have 2 bookend tackles that people are talking about postseason awards. People are talking about them being high draft picks. And frankly, I was disappointed in what both of them came to the table with. Now, the whole O-line, they struggled with twists that Idaho ran. They struggled with picking up backers. I felt like there were times where they even lost one-on-one matchups, and that just can't happen against an FCS opponent. You are an FBS team. You're a top 5 team in the country right now, at least based on the preseason rankings, and you certainly didn't look at it. You didn't look at it in the trenches, and that, I think, is why you didn't have those big explosive plays, and I think that's why you had a lot of drives that stalled out and didn't end up in points.
Hand up, I didn't play the game of football, so I don't know what I'm talking about in the X's and O's sense, but I read over and over again this offseason, I was told over and over again that this Oregon squad has the dudes, that they loaded up on them, whether it be the transfer portal, recent recruiting classes, that they have now at every position group the depth and the quality to be one of these national title contending teams. And I still believe that might be the case.
100%.
But having heard that all offseason, and I had an expectation today that it was going to look a little bit more like a David and Goliath matchup, that it was going to look a little bit more like the bully ball we've been told to expect. And other than maybe the first offensive possession for Idaho, it didn't look like bully ball. It looked like Oregon, a team who couldn't quite get into rhythm, having trouble with a feisty, plucky team that was frankly going toe-to-toe with them.
Well, and it was a lot of stupid mistakes that Coach Lanning's teams haven't made. We were talking about it before the show started, Buck. We've been doing this now for 3 years. In my 3 years of doing this show with you, I can't remember a time until today where I felt like Coach Lanning's squad didn't show up. Like when they lost to Georgia, they got the break speed off them, but that Georgia team was that much better than they were. It was never a question of like, well, did Coach Lanning get his guys ready to go? And it frankly, they didn't feel like they were ready to go. I remember early on in the second quarter, Connerly, he had 2 penalties for being lined up in the backfield.
Yeah.
As an offensive lineman, that cannot happen. I've played the position, albeit not as highly as they did, but I'll tell you right now, it's not that hard to have your head in your center's hip. And I think largely what Oregon was missing in this game, and this isn't to bag on anybody, this is more so to point out the fact of how blessed you've been at that center position. The first year that we did this, you had Alex Forsythe. He was a senior. He was a leader. He ended up being an NFL draft pick. He'd been in the system for a while, and I know it wasn't Dillingham's system, but he had been a Duck. And he knew what it meant to be a Duck, and he was a leader, and he was able to get his guys in the right spots. And last year, you had the best center in college football in Jackson Powers Johnson. I remember going into that offseason, it was, well, he's a great guard. Can we get him to play center? And all of a sudden, he turned into the best center in football and is now going to play and make a lot of money on Sundays. And frankly, this offensive line right now just doesn't have that center. That doesn't mean that they won't get there. Sometimes it takes a game or 2 or 4 or 5 to get ready to go, right? And the nice thing for you is you don't really have a true test until October 12th.
Already starting to look like a blessing, isn't it?
You do have some wiggle room. And you also have to remember, too, like, Dylan Gabriel's going to figure out things. Evan Stewart's going to figure out things.
Yeah.
That defensive secondary is going to get more shored up, and they really weren't an issue in this game. But when you have all these transfers, we've seen it takes 2, 3, 4 weeks, games. Sometimes it even takes a couple months. Jordan Birch didn't come on until late last year.
Yeah.
And it felt in this game he picked up where he left off last year. So while I do think there's a lot of Oregon fans that want to look at it and it's like, oh my God, the sky is falling. Our offensive line is horrible. We have no explosive plays. Our running backs keep falling down because the turf monster in Eugene keeps grabbing them. And in reality, it's take a deep breath. The O-line has a lot of things they need to improve on, specifically both of your tackles. They're supposed to be your big-time playmakers. They can't make the stupid mistakes that they made. They can't get beat one-on-one in matchups that they got beat on. You gave up 3 sacks. That can't happen. Whoever your center is going to be, he needs to be more vocal. Mm-hmm. He needs to get everyone on the same page so that there aren't linebackers running free. And then just understand that it's going to take a little bit of time for everyone to gel. Yep. But once they do, watch out because you still have the dudes.
So I guess I'm wondering where that leaves us, because we'll certainly find some positives in this, but I have always believed this team to be pretty disciplined and pretty buttoned up, and frankly have a coaching staff that won't allow really much else. And while some guys made some strides individually, it just kind of collectively felt meh. And I don't know if it's because you're playing in the afternoon heat. I don't know if it's because you've been reading all of your press clippings and hearing all the headlines all summer, but what's the mentality going into an opener, especially an opener where you're favored so heavily? Is it possible that they just weren't locked in?
Yeah, I think that's totally possible. I think it's possible that it hasn't been this hot this whole summer. It's been a pretty cool summer, and then all of a sudden it's super hot, and you kind of let it get to you a little bit. These are all things that are possible. But if you're an Oregon Ducks team that's supposed to be the 3rd team in the country, that's not an excuse. And you can't have this excuse, and Coach Lanning's not going to allow them to have this excuse. They are going to get better. It's going to take time for them to gel. Like I said, you have a bunch of transfers in. They have to learn how to play together. There are things that I would be worried about right now. I am worried about how the offensive line looks as a cohesive unit. I would be a little bit worried about buttoning certain things up. I think that Coach Lanning will do that. He's shown that he can do that, and he has done that in the past. The sky is not falling. That being said, if you have another scare next week against Boise State or against Oregon State, or these things don't get fixed and they don't get fixed fast, you're not going to beat Ohio State on October 12th.
No. In fact, I wonder if the look-ahead line is shifting at all today after tonight.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I know that
it has to.
Listen, with all of the attention and the Oregon has arrived banners that have been waved this offseason, the national media, at least in the Twitter sphere, has been very vocal tonight about Oregon not looking up to the part, or looking the part that they've been billed. Schultze, you've got some thoughts on this game. What was your general reaction to it? I know that this is the kind of thing that really chaps you when it seems like the better team just isn't taking care of business. What did you see out there?
Yeah, this is definitely the thing that chaps my ass as a Duck fan. It wasn't an 81-6 or 7 beatdown like we had against Portland State in last year's season opener.
No.
I feel like a lot of Duck fans were expecting that. I get it. You don't pay.
Was.
Yeah, you don't pay somebody to come in basically for a practice to then literally almost get beat by them. And you're talking about multiple All-Americans on the offensive line that had a very disappointing performance today. I'm scared. I'm not trying to just go off the cliff here, but I'm scared that Oregon isn't going to be able to compete like I thought they would against Boise State next week. I'm not even considering Ohio State yet. I'm worried because Oregon is so bad historically against Boise State that they're not even going to be able to compete. And for Boise State, I would assume it's kind of like their Super Bowl, their championship this year. They love to knock guys off. So I love the performance from Dylan Gabriel. Everybody, minus, of course, the fumble. I don't think the sacks were quite his fault. Everybody on Twitter saying, oh, Gabriel, not the quarterback I thought he was. He threw for almost 400 yards. Love that, but the offensive line scared me, and I'm a little concerned about those guys up front.
All right, Schultz, you bring up Dylan Gabriel's numbers, and it's at this point in time I would like to bring up our Ducks Game Day secret score.
Ducks Game Day secret score.
Now, this surprised me a little bit because there was a lot of sky is falling. There were some naysayers about Gabriel. He doesn't look like he's on the money. Mm-hmm. He's been off a couple here or there. Care to guess what his completion percentage was tonight, Will?
I have it in front of me. I'm cheating, but tell what the completion percentage is, and then I'll give my take because I kind of see where they're coming from.
Both
I
things
see
can be
where
true.
they're coming from.
Dylan Gabriel was 41 of 49 tonight for a completion percentage of 83.7%. That is your secret score, 83.7. You don't need the percent, but 83.7. Remember that secret score. Listen to the 7 a.m. hour of Monday's Dirt and Sprague and listen for your cue to text in. If you win or get that number, you could win the $100 gift card to Laurelhurst Market. Your secret score is 83.7. Go ahead, Will.
It felt very similar from Gabe Dillon, like Cam Ward last year. When Cam Ward was at WSU and he came into Autzen, he threw for over 400 yards passing.
Yeah.
He had I don't remember, it obviously was an 84% completion percentage, but it was above 50. I don't know if it was quite in the 60s. And if you looked at his stats, you'd go, wow, he threw for a lot of yards. Now, he only threw for 1 touchdown, so that must mean that WSU ran the ball for a lot of touchdowns. And then you look at the score, and Oregon blew WSU completely out of the water. And so it felt like in this game that there were a lot of Dylan Gabriel passes where it was just, let's get a bunch of yards, and he found ways to get a bunch of yards. And it wasn't always his fault why drives got stalled. I mean, when your offensive line gives up 2 sacks to one guy, I mean, that's a problem. When your offensive line keeps jumping off sides, or you get holding penalties, or you have these mistakes that just you're not used to seeing from an Oregon offensive line, that can kind of kill some of your drives, and that's why Gabriel didn't have as many touchdowns as you might want. But it really felt like from the 20 to the 20, he was money.
Yeah.
And then he didn't finish in the red zone. And the one thing that Bo Nix, even when we had, early on where Bo Nix, he didn't struggle, but he wasn't Bo Nix of last year where he's a Heisman candidate.
Sure.
He always finished in the red zone. And
Yep.
Gabriel didn't do that. And that's always going to leave a sour taste in fans' mouths because they are going to remember the last thing that you did. And the last thing that you did is not get into the end zone.
Yeah, I think we also have to remember that this is as good a quarterback that even though he was a Heisman candidate with Oklahoma, even though he lit it up for Central Florida, this is still a quarterback who's new to this program, who's working with a new offensive coordinator, who's working with a new center,
Right.
who's working with new receivers. You have O-linemen who are new working together. You have, for all those receivers, it's a different guy throwing them the ball last year, different timing. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that it is hard to have this many new pieces and all be on the same page right now. But I also expected there to be just a little bit more air of dominance today that I didn't quite see there.
It should have been. And look, it's a better Idaho team than Portland State. You can't compare this Idaho team to Portland
And
State.
I do
from
want to
an
give
FCS
Idaho credit. Those kids played their butts off. They
They're a
were
playoff.
really good.
They are a playoff team in FCS. They will be a playoff team again this year. They are a good team. You still should have put up 50,
Agreed.
and they should have put up 14
Yep.
or 7.
And-
you should have blown them out 100%.
Can I quickly add, this was probably Jack Lane's Super Bowl, too. Lake Oswego kid coming back. I bet he had a chip on his shoulder. I don't know if Oregon even called him or not. Probably not. So there's a reason that he balled out of his booty, or at least was ready with a flea flicker. But no, you should have scored 50. I agree.
You look at the stats, they are very misleading. If you go down the list, Gabriel has 380, Lane has 168. Gabriel's 84% completion, Lane is 44. When it comes to rushing, you have 107 yards on the ground. Most of it is by Jordan James. Idaho has 49. Most of it is by Cummings. They don't have a receiver over 57. You've got 2 guys in the 80s. And at the same time, you were basically 17-14 with 5 minutes left.
Yeah.
It's not finishing, and it's not doing the little things. I think the little things get fixed, and I think they get fixed fast.
I would agree.
That's what Lanning has always held his hat on, and you could tell just by looking at him on the sideline that he was upset. So if you're an Oregon Duck fan and you think the sky is falling, I think you're wrong. But I definitely see why you're worried, and you should be worried, and it's because you're a fan and you're fanatical, and right now you have one test where you can judge everything on, and you didn't get an A in that test. You got a C, maybe even a D.